The sky over the prairie was a sheet of tarnished silver, the clouds heavy and low like a warning whispered by the wind. Snow drifted sideways, not falling, but slicing through the air. The wagon wheels creaked under the weight of supplies, creaked with every cruel intention that had festered inside Caleb Thorne since the war stole his wife and Mercy alike. "Get down," he snapped, his voice rough as gravel. The reins in his hands jerked as he pulled the horses to a halt near a narrow clearing where skeletal trees reached like bony fingers. "This is as far as I'll take you." Hattie Thorne, the eldest at 22, met her father's eyes without flinching. She had her mother's steel in her, though the world had already tried to burn it out. "It's nearly night," she said quietly. "You'll leave us out here with nothing?" Caleb spat into the snow. "I gave you years I didn't have to. Now you're not my concern. You're women, too old, too stubborn, too full of yourselves to obey a man's rule. Let the wilderness raise you better than I did." Clover whimpered from the back of the wagon. 16, slight as a sapling, she clutched her satchel like it held the last of her hope. June, hot-blooded and sharp-tongued at 20, bristled and stood, fists clenched. "You think you'll sleep easy, Pa, after doing this?" Caleb's eyes narrowed. "I'll sleep just fine. I sleep better without mouths whining all night. Now go." Lark, 18 and quiet as morning fog, slipped from the wagon last. She looked back once at the horses, the only warmth they'd known in weeks. Then the reins cracked and the wagon pulled away, its tracks slicing into the snow, vanishing into the horizon like they'd never been there at all. The girls stood in silence. Wind howled through the bare trees. Not a single bird sang. It was Hattie who moved first. "We walk." "Where?" Clover's voice was paper-thin. "Anywhere that isn't here." They bundled together, thin cloaks no match for the cold, and walked. The prairie was endless. The sun dipped and the temperature followed. The sky bruised to purple. Coyotes called in the distance, and every shadow seemed to move with teeth. By nightfall, Clover had stumbled 3 times. Hattie lifted her onto her back. "Just hold on," she said. "We'll find something." June stalked ahead like she could outpace despair. "He did this to us," she muttered. "Our own blood. Threw us like scraps. He was always waiting for a reason," Lark said softly, eyes scanning the trees. "We just finally gave him one." They found the cabin just before moonrise. It was half-sunken, tilted, roof patched with animal hide and moss, but it had walls. Shelter. Hattie kicked the door open with a boot, startled a squirrel out of the rafters, and herded them inside. It was dark, musty, and freezing. June dragged over a broken chair and smashed it to pieces. Kindling. Lark struck flint from a piece of rock she'd tucked into her dress. Sparks flew, and soon smoke curled through the cracks in the beams. The flames caught, meager but alive. Clover curled up beside the fire like a pup and whispered, "This counts as surviving, right?" "For now," Hattie said. They took stock. 2 apples, 1 loaf of bread gone hard, a skin of water, a few buttons, some scraps of cloth, and Lark's knife. They didn't sleep. The cabin groaned under the weight of wind and snow. A wolf howled near dawn. June sat by the fire, knife across her knees, eyes open and angry. "You really think he won't come back?" she asked. "No," Hattie said. "And if he does, it won't be for us. It'll be for what he can sell." Clover laughed, too loud and too sudden. "Maybe we'll become legends. The 4 ghost girls of the prairie. Men will whisper that we ride wolves and eat settler hearts." June raised a brow. "You've lost it." "No," Clover grinned, lips cracked and eyes bright with cold. "I'm just choosing not to cry." The next morning, Lark spotted deer tracks in the snow. She and Hattie followed them out to a small frozen stream and found a rabbit trap someone else had laid and abandoned. The meat was still good. They didn't question it. That evening, they cooked rabbit stew over a fire made of chair legs and dry moss. It was the best meal they'd had in weeks. For a moment, they laughed. Lark told stories of birds she'd watched nesting in chimneys. June mimicked Caleb's drawl until even Hattie cracked a smile. But outside, the night had changed. It was too still, too quiet. June stood and crept to the window. She pressed her cheek to a slat and froze. "Someone's out there." The fire popped. Hattie grabbed the knife. Clover went silent. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circled the cabin. Snow creaked. Someone breathed just beyond the door. Lark held her breath. Then a voice. Low, steady, not settler English. A language none of the girls understood, but still felt the weight of. Another voice answered it, also calm, younger. The handle of the door turned once, then let go. Hattie stepped forward, knife trembling in her grip. The door didn't open. The footsteps retreated. But something had been left. Lark opened the door slowly. On the ground was a bundle. Smoked meat, dried berries, a waterskin, and a fur pelt. The girls stared. Clover whispered, I told you. The prairie doesn't just take. Sometimes it gives. That night, they slept with the fire high, the pelt over their shoulders, and food in their bellies. But none of them forgot the footprints outside the door, or the way the wind seemed to whisper names they had never learned. When dawn came, it was clear they were not alone in the wilderness, and whoever had found them hadn't come to harm. Not yet. Not all men came with ropes and rage. Some came with silence and watchful eyes. And perhaps, just perhaps, with something close to fate. The sun rose low and red, bleeding across the frozen plains like a wound slow to close. The sky, washed in winter gold, revealed what the night had hidden. A new set of tracks outside the cabin, soft, deliberate, not left by boots, but by moccasins. 4 sets. Men. They had walked the cabin's perimeter, left offerings, and then vanished like smoke. The sisters rose slowly, uncertain whether to be afraid or grateful. Hattie crouched near the door and traced the tracks with her fingers. They were deep, but not hurried. She glanced up at the distant line of cottonwoods beyond the frozen creek. They didn't run, she said. They watched. June tightened her jaw. Watched us sleep like we're animals in a pen. Protected, Lark murmured, stepping beside her. Or tested. They left meat, Clover offered from the fire pit, chewing the last strip. If they wanted us gone, they wouldn't have fed us. Hattie's eyes narrowed toward the horizon. They'll come back. We need to be ready. But nothing could have prepared them for who came walking out of the forest that afternoon. For Comanche men stepped through the tree line as silent as mist, eyes sharp, hands empty, shoulders squared like the prairie itself had carved them from stone and wind. The one in front had high cheekbones and a gaze steady as thunderclouds. His name, they'd later learn, was Teomni, he who stands quiet before storms. He said nothing at first, only observed. His cloak was wolf-hide, and the eagle feather in his braid glinted like a blade. Beside him stood Wisa, lean, wiry, and mischievous-eyed. He was the first to smile, though it was more curiosity than warmth. He held no weapon, just a carved stick he idly tapped against his boot. Chitto stood third, the largest of them all. His expression was unreadable. A long scar ran down his shoulder and disappeared beneath a deerskin vest. His gaze lingered longest on Clover. And then there was Takota, the youngest, barely older than June. He walked a step behind the others, his face open and watchful, hands never far from the knife at his hip. Hattie stood first. Her voice did not waver. We have no quarrel with you. Teomni didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his palm, fingers open, not a greeting, but a gesture of peace. Lark stepped forward and knelt slowly, touching her hand to the snow, then to her chest, mimicking the sign. The smallest exchange sparked the first bridge between them. Takota tilted his head. Then, softly, in halting English, said, "No fight." Wisa laughed. "Only cold and hungry girls with big eyes." June bristled. "You mocking us or helping?" Wisa grinned wider. "Can't it be both?" Hattie placed a hand on June's shoulder. "Let them speak." Teomni stepped forward. "You are not safe here. Many men, bad men, ride this land. You are alone. And you aren't." Clover asked. "There's 4 of you. There's 4 of us." Wisa chuckled. "We are more than 4. They'll think we were taken," June muttered bitterly. "Dragged off like prizes." Chitto's voice was deep and gravelly. "We don't steal what's broken. We help fix it." That night, the warriors stayed near the cabin, their campfire barely visible through the trees. But the girls knew they were being guarded. The days that followed were uneasy. The men brought more food, jerk bison, maize cakes wrapped in corn leaves, sweet pine tea. Dakota mended the cabin's roof without being asked. Wisa showed Clover how to bind her sore ankle with hide strips. But not everything was easy. June remained defensive, especially toward Wisa's teasing. "What's your game?" she snapped one morning. "Play at charming the white girl for sport?" He looked at her, oddly serious for once. "You think I would waste time with someone who wastes fire? What's that supposed to mean?" "You burn hot, June. But you don't know how to warm anyone." She said nothing, but the silence between them grew heavier, and somehow more charged. Lark, ever quiet, began asking Dakota about the land. He showed her which trees the birds nested in, where to listen for fox tracks under the snow. One night, he handed her a stone with spiral markings. "Fossil," he said. "Very old. Like the earth remembers when there were seas." She turned it over in her hand, eyes wide. "Do you think the earth remembers people too?" He nodded. "It remembers what matters." Inside the cabin, Clover watched Chido sharpen his blade by firelight. She curled next to him with a blanket, staring. "You talk less than a stone," she said, smiling. "But stones still sit with people." He looked at her, then at the bandage around her foot. "Pain makes the mouth move. Healing makes it still." "You say that like you've done both." "I have." The sisters learned quickly. These men were not raiders. They were watchers, guardians, survivors. Warriors, yes, but also men who knew loneliness. Men who had buried brothers and heard the same wind speak of ghosts. Then came the riders. The first warning was a hawk cry, high and sharp. Teomni stood from the edge of the hill and looked east. "Settlers," he said. 20 horses. Guns. They found us." Clover whispered. "No," Wisa said. "They're looking. And they've been told what to find." The girl's father had returned. Teomni gathered the sisters. "If you stay here, they will come. They will take you, claim you, say you were stolen. They'll never believe we stayed by choice," Hattie muttered. Wisa spat into the snow. "Settlers don't care about truth. Only stories." Hattie looked at her sisters. One by one, they met her gaze. And one by one, they nodded. "We'll go with you," she said. The Comanche led them west, deeper into land where the trees thickened and the sky seemed to lower like a secret. They crossed frozen rivers, hiked through moonlit ridges. Along the way, they learned more. Teomni was a former war chief who had lost his brother to settler ambush. Since then, he had chosen the path of peace, not from weakness, but from weariness. Wisa had nearly been hanged in a town called Red Bluff, saved only when he escaped with nothing but a bullet in his side and a laugh on his lips. Chido once had a wife who died in childbirth. He hadn't spoken much since. Dakota had never known his mother. Raised by the elders, he believed in omens, dreams, and the idea that everything that crossed your path did so for a reason. The girls began to change too. June stopped seeing mockery in every smile. Hattie let others lead, just sometimes. Lark began to speak her dreams aloud. And Clover laughed, not to hide pain, but because she felt light for the first time. At the Comanche camp, the girls were greeted not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity. The elders said nothing, but watched. The women offered warmth and blankets. Children ran, giggling, around Clover's feet. "We don't belong anywhere," June said one night as they sat by a fire ringed with stones. "Not to the settlers. Not to your people." Wisa replied, "Then perhaps you belong to each other." Teomni turned to Hattie. "And to those who stand with you, not over you." That night, a drumbeat echoed through the trees, soft, slow, steady. An elder burned sage and said prayers in Comanche. The girls stood among the tribe, unsure, but welcome. They didn't know what came next, but they knew they weren't alone. And in the eyes of 4 warriors who had every reason not to trust, they saw something new. Recognition, respect, and the first fragile sparks of love. The snow fell light and slow, like feathers drifting from the past. And far off in the hills, smoke curled from a different fire. one made by men who still believed in ownership, not choice. They would come. They would bring bullets, fire, and lies. But this time, the sisters would not hide behind doors. They would stand beneath open skies. And they would not be taken. The moon hung full and pale above the Comanche camp, casting long silver shadows that danced between the teepees and fires. Hattie stood beside Taamni at the edge of the encampment, her arms crossed against the night chill, watching a line of stars flicker across the plains. She hadn't spoken in a while, hadn't needed to. Taamni was a man who didn't crowd silence, he guarded it. And somehow, in that quiet, Hattie felt more seen than she ever had under a roof built by men who barked orders and never listened. He finally spoke, his voice low. "Do you still feel lost?" She thought for a moment. "I used to think home was a place. Now I wonder if it's a person." He turned to her slowly. "And are you still looking for one?" "No," she said softly, eyes meeting his. "I think I found four." In the weeks since they had left the cabin behind, everything had changed, inside and out. The four sisters, once cast-offs in threadbare dresses, had begun to find something that looked and felt like a life. Each of them had drawn toward a different fire, a different rhythm of living, and slowly, like rivers carving into stone, they were changed by it. June, who had once bristled at every voice not her own, now sparred with Wisa daily, but not with anger. Their exchanges had become a kind of language, sharp and playful, always just shy of touching something tender. One afternoon, she found Wisa practicing with a bow, loosing arrows into a tree stump with effortless grace. She leaned against a nearby rock, arms crossed. "You miss that stump, and I get to cut off that braid," she teased. Wisa smirked. "You talk like you've earned a blade." She stepped closer. "I did. Survived years under my father's roof." He loosed another arrow. Bullseye. "That's surviving, not living." She tilted her head. "And what's the difference?" He lowered the bow, looked straight at her. "Surviving is breathing. Living is choosing who you breathe beside." She didn't reply. But the next day, she started wearing one of his spare eagle feathers braided into her hair. Lark, ever the quietest, spent most of her time beyond the camp's edge. She wandered with Takota, gathering herbs, touching bark, asking the names of things the wind brushed past. Takota showed her where deer bedded in the high grass, how to read clouds like omens, and how to follow birds to water. One morning, they sat near a frozen stream, hands cold, hearts warm. "I used to think I was too soft for the world," Lark whispered, tracing the frost with a finger. Takota handed her a flat stone shaped like a leaf. "Soft things survive better than hard ones. They bend. They grow back." Lark smiled shyly. "I used to dream of someone who knew the names of stars." He looked at her. "I don't know the names, but I see them, every night. And now when I do, I think of you." Back in the heart of the camp, Clover had woven herself into daily life with a resilience that surprised even her sisters. She limped less, laughed more, and had taken to following Chitto during morning duties. He spoke sparingly, but she filled in the gaps, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with quiet humming. One morning, as snow dusted the earth, she knelt beside him as he cleaned a set of knives. "You know," she said, "my sisters used to say I was the weakest, that I'd never survive without them." He didn't look up. Were they wrong? She thought about it. "I think they forgot I had more to live for." Chitto paused. "What is it you live for now?" She looked at him, her breath puffing in the cold. "For the feeling I get when you look at me, like I'm not broken." He turned to her, face unreadable, then took her hand and placed a carved wooden charm in her palm. A small horse, painted with red and white streaks. "This was my daughter's." Clover blinked, startled. "You had a daughter?" He nodded. "She died. Long ago." She held the charm tighter. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." "Then why give me this?" "Because something in you reminds me what it felt like to have hope." Evenings in the camp grew warmer, not from the fires, but from laughter. From the rhythm of new patterns formed between four girls once discarded, and the four men who saw them not as burdens, but as something sacred. A kind of family that defied blood and borders. Still, not all was peace. Word came from the western hills. A settler patrol had been spotted. armed, angry, asking questions. Taamni gathered the sisters one evening. "They are hunting for you," he said. June's fist clenched. "Our father. He leads them." Hattie felt the familiar knot rise in her chest. "He won't believe we chose to be here." "He doesn't want to believe it," Taamni replied. "To men like him, women are possessions. When he threw you away, you became dangerous. You chose yourselves." "Then what do we do?" Lark asked. "We stand," Wisa said simply. Chido added, "You have roots here now. Don't cut them for a man who never wanted you to grow." Dakota looked at Lark. "You are not girls in a cabin anymore. You are women with fire." That night, the sisters sat alone by a small flame outside their shared lodge. Clover leaned her head on Hattie's shoulder. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Hattie looked at the fire. "I think the right thing is often the hardest. But I also think no one should tell us where we belong except our own hearts." June nodded. "If he comes, I won't run. Not this time." Lark whispered, "We've been thrown away once. We're not going quietly again." Above them, the stars shimmered like flint sparks across velvet. In the stillness, they made a silent vow. Not to fight because they had to, but because no one would ever steal their names again. They had been cast out, called too wild, too broken, too much. But here, with hands that fed them, arms that held them, and eyes that saw them, they had become something new. Wives? Not yet. Warriors? Maybe. But more than anything, they were fire. And if the world came for them again, it would find them waiting. With flint, with flame, and with the strength to burn everything that ever tried to bury them. The wind changed direction, and somewhere out in the dark, horses gathered. The first scent was smoke. It drifted across the plains just after sunrise, thin, acrid, foreign. Not the familiar smoke of pine or buffalo dung, but the sharp stench of burning oil and canvas. A message, a warning, or perhaps a declaration. Hattie stood at the edge of the Comanche village, her breath visible in the morning chill, watching a faint plume rise to the east. Taamni joined her, saying nothing. He didn't need to. She already knew. Caleb Thorne was coming, not just with words, but with fire and steel and the righteous fury of a man who believed himself wronged. He had brought guns, men, and the law behind him, or at least the illusion of it. A posse of settlers and bounty hunters, bristling with rifles and half-truths, convinced they were marching to save 4 daughters, kidnapped by savages. No one had kidnapped them, but Caleb had never been a man concerned with truth. In the village, war drums began to beat. Slow, steady, final. Children were gathered by the elders. Women packed what they could. The warriors painted their faces in silence. Chido tightened the band around his wrist, then handed Clover a small pouch. "Gunpowder," he said. "If you need to blind, not kill." "I won't let them take me," she whispered. "I know," he replied. Dakota laid arrows along a rock, then knelt beside Lark. She was plucking herbs furiously, shaking fingers and lips pressed tight. "You don't have to stay and fight," he told her gently. Lark looked up. "I do." He nodded, handing her his knife. "Then stay behind me, and throw this if you must." June was already on horseback, riding with Wisa to scout the ridge where the posse would approach. They returned just before midday, their faces windburned and grave. 21 riders, June said. Half with rifles, the rest with pistols. They're burning everything they pass. They expect surrender, Wisa muttered. Or blood. Taamni turned to the sisters. "You are not of my people by blood, but you have been accepted by spirit. I will not send you to hide if you choose to stay. But I must ask, are you ready?" Hattie stepped forward. "We've been running all our lives. From our father, from his violence, from being less than. But not anymore." She looked at her sisters. Clover, her jaw tight, her hands scarred but steady. Lark, tender but fierce, holding herbs and a blade like they were sacred. June, angry as ever, but now her rage had purpose. They each nodded. Then it began. The riders came like thunder, hooves pounding the dry earth, banners snapping, voices shouting. Caleb Thorne rode in front, his eyes wild, his gray beard stiff with frost. "Hattie," he bellowed. "Girls, I'm here to take you home." June stepped forward, pistol drawn. "We are home," he snarled, lifting his rifle. "You've been brainwashed. Stolen. Look what you've become, whores and skins, living like animals." Hattie didn't flinch. "You left us to die. These people saved us. You don't get to call that love." Gunfire cracked. The battle began. The Comanche warriors moved like water, swift, efficient, always in pairs. Taamni fought beside Hattie, guarding her as she reloaded her rifle with steady hands. Wisa darted between horses, firing arrows with a grin that never left his face. June rode hard, leading 3 riders into a trap where Lark had strung hidden vines and set snares. One man's horse crashed into a pit. Another was knocked cold by a rock to the head. Lark crouched behind a stone outcrop, flinging herbs into the fire behind her. The smoke turned thick, choking. Her concoction burned the eyes of the oncoming riders, disorienting them. "Nice," Dakota said, handing her another bundle. Chido fought with brutal precision. One settler raised a shotgun toward Clover, only to fall with a thud as Chido's tomahawk buried deep in his side. Clover didn't freeze. She dragged the man's pistol to safety and fired at another charging attacker. They held the ridge. But Caleb wasn't done. He dismounted, stomped through the smoke and chaos like a storm, pistol in hand, heading straight for Hattie. "I raised you," he shouted, "and I'll be damned if you shame me like this." "You didn't raise us," Hattie said, gun trembling in her grip. "You broke us." He raised the pistol. Taamni stepped in the way. The shot rang out, loud, final. Taamni staggered, but he didn't fall. The bullet had struck his shoulder, grazing deep but not fatal. Hattie screamed and raised a rifle. Caleb was reloading. Slow, deliberate. Hattie had the chance. One pull of the trigger and it would be done. But she didn't fire. Instead, she walked straight to him, rifle lowered, her voice shaking. "You don't control me anymore." He stared at her, disbelief twisting his features. She pulled the rifle back and cracked it across his face. Caleb Thorne crumpled to the ground. The remaining settlers fled. The posse, seeing their leader fall and the Comanche unbroken, turned tail and vanished into the trees. The fight was over. Smoke drifted like ghosts over the field. Clover sat beside Chido, bandaging a shallow cut on his leg. "Looks like we get to live," she said. He placed a hand on hers. "We get to build." Lark leaned into Dakota's shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever be safe?" "No," he answered, "but we'll always have each other." June walked to Wisa, who had a fresh bruise blooming across his jaw. "You look like hell," she said. He grinned. "You love it." She kissed him without answering. At sunset, the elders gathered, for fires were lit. The drums began again, not of war, but of union. The marriages were not loud, not ceremonial in the settler way, but they were sacred, witnessed by ancestors and sky, by earth and fire. Taamni stood beside Hattie, his wound wrapped, his eyes clear. He spoke a vow in Comanche, then again in broken English. "You are my storm, my stillness, my blood." She smiled. "And you are the man who gave me back my name." Wisa placed a carved pendant around June's neck. "You fight like a hawk. You love like thunder." "I choose you," she whispered, "and I'll keep choosing you." Dakota offered Lark a necklace of beads and bone. "You listen when others speak only to be heard. I will listen to you all my life." Lark's voice was barely audible. "And I will walk beside you, wherever the wind carries us." Chido handed Clover a single feather, dipped in red ochre. "You made me feel again." She held his hand. "You made me strong." As darkness fell, the fires burned high. Songs rose. Children danced. Elders smiled. And for the first time in their lives, the 4 sisters were not running, not surviving. They were rooted, chosen, whole. Later, as the fires burned low, Hattie stood alone for a moment, watching the sky. June stepped beside her. "You think Pa will come back?" "No," she said. "He's done." "And if someone else tries to take us?" "We'll remind them," Hattie said, voice soft but steady. that we were never theirs to begin with. Behind them, the 4 Comanche warriors sat by the fire, watching the women they had fought for, healed with, and married. They hadn't rescued broken girls. They had partnered with women who had become fire. And in the ashes of what was, something new had been forged. A home that couldn't be taken. A love that didn't ask permission. A vow not written on paper, but carved in courage. And if the wind carried stories across the plains for years to come, it would tell of 4 settler girls cast into the wilderness, and how the wilderness gave them back to the world as legends. The snow had started falling before dawn, drifting down like sorrow in slow motion, each flake as silent as the eyes that would soon watch her walk the aisle alone. The chapel stood at the edge of town, its paint weather-worn and peeling, but its bell still rang true when pulled. Clara Wynne stood beside its doors in her wedding dress, its hem already heavy with slush. Her hands, pale and steady, smoothed the creased lace down over her stomach, a gesture so gentle it might have gone unnoticed by those who weren't looking closely. But no one was truly looking. Inside, the pews filled with whispers and glances, with townsfolk drawn more by scandal than celebration. There was Mrs. Melgrove, holding her daughter close as if shame were contagious. Mr. Finch sat 2 rows behind her, chewing on his pipe, waiting for the spectacle he'd heard about at the barber shop. Even Pastor Hale's voice sounded brittle as he rehearsed the vows under his breath, eyes flicking toward the window like he wanted to be anywhere else. Tobias Leary stood at the altar, sharp in his suit, boots polished, jaw clenched. His smile was thin, like something drawn on in chalk. Tobias had been a man quick to court and quicker still to boast. He liked Clara's letters, admired her penmanship, thought her name sounded respectable. But what he hadn't liked, what he hadn't been told, was that Clara came not alone, but carrying the last remaining piece of someone else's life. He'd found out just days before through a carelessly open parcel that revealed a baby's blanket embroidered with the initials of another man. Her late husband, lost to a wagon accident on the far ridge. Tobias had said little then, just looked at her with a hardness that didn't belong in his eyes and walked off, leaving the wind to do the talking. Clara had known since that moment that something had shifted. Yet here she stood, lips dry, breath curling like mist in the cold air, waiting to see if today would be mercy or cruelty. When the chapel doors opened, she stepped through like a ghost through mist. The hush was immediate. Even the children stilled, sensing the tension their parents refused to name. Clara's dress had once been ivory, but it bore the wear of travel. She had sewn it herself, every stitch a quiet prayer that somewhere, someone might want more than a fresh-faced bride with no past. She walked without a father to give her away. Her own had died when she was a girl, and the town knew it. Yet they stared as if her solitude were her fault, as if her growing stomach wasn't wrapped in the ache of widowhood, but in shame. Tobias did not reach for her hand. She paused before him, a breath between them like a chasm. Pastor Hale cleared his throat, but Tobias spoke first. "I can't do this," he said. "Not like this." The words fell flat and hard, like a shovel striking stone. Clara blinked once. The world did not spin, nor did her knees give way. She simply stood there, absorbing the blow like the prairie absorbs the first snow, quiet, unmoving, knowing it would not be the last. There was a moment, a heartbeat, where no one moved. Then came the murmurs. A woman gasped. A child asked his mother what had happened. Someone in the back snorted. And Tobias turned, his boots clicking against the chapel floor as he walked out, his shoulders stiff with self-righteousness. Pastor Hale shifted awkwardly, closing his book. "Perhaps we should all." But Clara had already turned as well, walking back down the aisle, slower now, her head still high. Her eyes did not meet the crowd's, though she felt them like thorns. Some looked away. Some watched with cruel curiosity. Not one person rose to walk beside her. Outside, the snow continued to fall. She stood for a moment beneath the chapel's overhang, eyes closed, breathing in the winter air like it might cleanse her. The wind carried voices from within. The word pregnant echoed once, followed by laughter. She stepped into the snow and did not cry. Down the street, she passed the general store, its windows fogged from inside. A boy pressed his face to the glass to watch her. His mother pulled him back without a word. At the boarding house, the landlady stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I rented your room already," she called. "Figured you'd be leaving after today." Clara gave a slight nod and moved on. Her valise was heavy in her gloved hand, though not as heavy as her silence. By the river's edge, she found a bench half buried in snow. She sat there, the dress pooling around her like a memory she couldn't take off. Somewhere in town, a door slammed. Somewhere else, a piano played an off-key tune. Clara listened to none of it. Her hands rested again over the swell of her stomach, not yet prominent, but known. "I'll find a place for us," she whispered to the child who could not yet hear. "I promise." A horse passed behind her, slow. She didn't turn, but the rider did. Elias Hart had watched it unfold from the back pew, standing by the wall like a shadow. He hadn't come to gawk. He never did. Elias rarely entered town at all unless the forge was slow, and he needed nails or salt. His eyes were calm, his face lined in a way that made men think he was older than he was. In truth, grief had aged him more than time ever could. He had watched Tobias speak, watched Clara break without breaking. And now, riding past the chapel with the snow beginning to thicken, he saw her again, alone, discarded, still sitting upright. He reined in the horse, said nothing, just looked at her. She turned then, slowly. Her eyes met his, quiet and unflinching. Not hopeful, not bitter, simply present. He nodded once, tipping his hat, and rode on. Clara did not know his name, but she remembered that he did not look away. When night came, she found her way back to the chapel. No one had locked it. She wrapped herself in a thin quilt from the back room and lay down on a pew. The air was sharp, but the silence was warmer than the town's eyes. She stared at the rafters and thought of her husband, gone now 2 seasons. He'd never even heard her speak of names for their child. They'd spoken more of fences and grain, of where to plant trees come spring. She missed the quiet between them, the comfort of not needing to be more than herself. Somewhere in the dark, a floorboard creaked. But it was only the old wood settling, not a soul come to check on her. She placed a hand over her belly once more, murmuring a name she hadn't said aloud. Clara would not run. She would not beg. But tomorrow she would stand up again. And somewhere, though she did not yet know where, a fire still waited to be lit. The morning after her almost wedding, Clara awoke in the chapel with frost in her hair and the quilt still wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her breath puffed before her in slow, white curls. The wooden pew she'd slept on left marks on her cheek, but she hadn't moved much through the night. Dreams had stayed away, as if afraid to enter a heart already too full of ache. She sat up, her hands instinctively brushing over the small rise beneath her dress. "Still here," she whispered to the child. "Still ours." Outside, the wind had died down, but the cold clung to every surface like judgment. Clara stepped into the town with quiet feet, holding the valise that now carried everything she owned. Her wedding dress had been folded and stored inside it last night with slow, careful hands. She hadn't cried over it, just folded it like one folds away a season that didn't last long enough. Snow crunched under her boots as she crossed the boardwalk. Townspeople passed by with eyes that flinched away too quickly. No one said good morning. No one asked where she would go. They only offered silence, or worse, the tight-lipped smirks of those who felt vindicated by another's pain. At the general store, Mrs. Melgrove stood behind a barrel of potatoes, discussing Clara with 2 other women, just loud enough for her to hear. "I told my Henry it wasn't right," she said, smoothing the front of her apron. "Marrying a woman who's already expecting. Doesn't matter if she's widowed or not. She should have told the truth." "She probably hoped he wouldn't notice until it was too late," said the other woman, her gloved fingers selecting a jar of preserves. "Some women are like that, trapping decent men." "Decent," Mrs. Melgrove scoffed. "Tobias Leary's never been decent a day in his life." They all laughed, and Clara passed them without a word. She didn't stop at the bakery or the mercantile. She didn't knock on any doors or ask for work. The only place left that hadn't turned its back was the old barn behind the chapel, its loft still dry enough to sleep in, so long as the snow didn't blow too hard from the east. She spent the day sitting beside the frozen creek, where dry reeds hissed in the wind. She watched birds scratch at the earth for seeds and let the cold soak into her until she felt nothing at all. Her thoughts wandered to the time before the letter, before Tobias, when she and her husband had lived in a small house with a sagging porch and plans for spring planting. He had been kind, not a man of many words, but when he touched her, he did so like he was speaking to her soul. When he died, it was quick. A wheel came off the wagon, the mule panicked, and the fall broke him before the pain could. She had buried him with her own hands and stayed on the land for as long as she could. But grief does not pay debts, and kindness does not plant corn. When the neighbors grew quiet, and the creditors grew louder, Clara packed what she could and answered an advertisement for a bride. Now, she had neither the land nor the promise, just a child that grew despite it all. Later that afternoon, as she hauled a bucket of water from the chapel's well, her gloved fingers stiff and aching, she caught sight of a man standing across the street. He was tall, lean, and wore a long coat with the collar turned up against the cold. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but she recognized him. He'd been at the chapel, in the back, watching. He didn't approach, just nodded once, then turned and disappeared down the road, leading a gray mule behind him. She found herself thinking of him again that evening, as she tried to build a small fire in the barn's old stove. The wood was damp. The flame kept dying. She gave up eventually and pulled her quilt tighter, resting her back against a stack of hay bales. The baby shifted within her, reminding her gently that she was not alone. 2 days passed. No one asked after her. When she returned to the well on the third morning, a basket sat beside it. A loaf of cornbread, still warm. A small jar of honey. A pair of woolen mittens that looked hand-knitted. No note. No signature. Clara looked around. The road was empty, the sky heavy with clouds. She took the basket with careful hands, her throat tightening in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. That night, she ate slowly, savoring each bite. The sweetness of the honey stung her tongue, made her eyes water. She folded the mittens into her coat pocket and whispered a thank you to no one. The next day brought more snow, heavy, wet flakes that blanketed the town in silence. Clara walked to the chapel again, brushing snow from the pews, lighting the stove with pine kindling she'd gathered from the edge of the woods. She didn't know why she kept the chapel clean. Perhaps because it was the only place that hadn't asked her to leave. As she swept, the door creaked open behind her. She turned, half expecting the pastor. Instead, the blacksmith stood there. Elias Hart. He didn't speak right away. Just removed his hat, letting snowflakes melt in his dark hair. "Thought you might need dry firewood," he said. She nodded. "I do." He walked in, his steps steady and deliberate, and set the wood by the stove. Then he looked around the small space, his eyes lingering on the cracked stained glass windows, the faded hymnals stacked in the corner. "You live here now?" "I sleep here," she said. "There's a difference." He gave a small nod, like he understood more than he said. They didn't talk much that day, but he came back the next, with more wood and a jar of preserves from his shelf. The day after that, he brought a hammer and nails and helped patch a hole in the roof where the wind kept slipping in. Each visit was quiet, gentle. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. He told her once, while mending a broken bench, that his wife had died in the spring floods 2 years past. She'd been planting squash when the water came too fast. Their boy had died before that, measles. A life carved hollow by loss, but not bitterness. Clara listened, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like her grief made her a burden. One afternoon, as she stood by the creek again, Elias walked up beside her, holding something wrapped in a cloth. He unwrapped it and held out a wooden figure, a tiny horse, smooth and painted, its legs sturdy and its face carved with quiet care. "For the child," he said. Clara held it in both hands, the wood warm from his coat. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't say anything, just looked out at the frozen water. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because I saw you. That day. No one else did." She turned the horse over in her palm, feeling the weight of it. "They said I should have told him sooner," she said. "They say a lot of things," he replied. She looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't handsome in the way Tobias had been, but there was something in his stillness that felt stronger than muscles or charm. A kind of quiet you could build a life inside. Word of their conversation spread. It always did in towns like this. People started talking about her again. About how quickly she'd taken up with another man. About how maybe she'd lied about being widowed at all. About how Elias had always been odd, too slow to speak, too quick to help. She overheard Mrs. Melgrove muttering at the mercantile. "She's got a way of catching pity like a fisherwoman catches trout." But Clara no longer flinched. She kept sweeping the chapel, kept eating what Elias brought, kept carving out days from the quiet. Then, one Sunday morning, Tobias returned. He came in on horseback, face clean-shaven, wearing a fresh coat. He stood outside the chapel after service, smiling at townsfolk like nothing had ever happened. When Clara walked past him, he caught her wrist. "We need to talk," he said. "No, we don't." "I made a mistake," he said. "You should have told me, but still, I could have handled it better." She looked at him. He was still beautiful in that hollow way. "I'm not something you get to redo," she said softly. "This isn't a garment you return and buy again in a different color." He flushed but still smiled. "You always talk fancy. And you never listened." She pulled her hand free and walked away, her boots crunching firm through the snow. That night, Elias didn't bring anything. He just stood at the chapel door, his coat dusted with flakes, and said, "You don't owe anyone forgiveness." "I know," she said. He waited a moment, then asked, "Do you want to come with me tomorrow? I could use help in the forge, just sorting things." She nodded. Not yes, not maybe, just nodded. And in that small gesture, something began. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of trust. And trust, Clara had learned, was how light entered even the most winter-worn places. The forge was warmer than any place Clara had been in weeks. Not just from the fire that glowed in the belly of the furnace, but from the rhythm of it, steady, purposeful. Elias moved through the space like a man who'd made peace with solitude. He hammered with patience, the sound deep and almost meditative, like a heartbeat echoing in iron. Clara stood at a worn work table, sorting nails and bolts into rusted tins. Her fingers worked methodically, soot streaking the tips, the smell of smoke curling into her clothes. She didn't mind. It was the kind of silence she understood, not hollow, but filled with doing. The kind where a soul could begin to breathe again. It had been 2 weeks since Tobias reappeared. He hadn't approached her again. Not directly. But she'd seen him talking to townsfolk, planting his version of the story like weeds. She could hear it in their tones. The shift. The same women who once whispered behind handkerchiefs now made comments just loud enough for her to catch. That maybe she had lied about being widowed. That maybe the child wasn't her husband's at all. Clara said nothing, but the weight of it pressed deeper with each passing day. That afternoon, as the wind howled outside and the forge crackled with warmth, Elias set his tongs down and wiped his hands on a rag. "You don't have to stay here every day," he said without looking at her. "I know. You could go somewhere, find another town." "I could." He glanced up. His gaze held hers for a long moment. "Then why don't you?" Clara paused, the tin of nails in her hands. "Because I've run enough," she said. "And because this place may be cruel, but at least it's honest about it. Some places pretend to be kind while they bleed you slow." Elias nodded, slow and thoughtful. Then he reached beneath the workbench and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "I wrote to someone," he said, "few towns over. A Reverend Marks. Used to know him when he came through selling Bibles on horseback. Said he'd check some records for me." Clara blinked. "Why?" "Because I wanted the truth. And I figured if I wanted it, some others might too." She took the letter with both hands. Her eyes skimmed the neat, slanted handwriting. It confirmed everything. Her marriage. the date, the obituary for her husband, the registry of the land they'd worked, and the birth record in progress for the child soon to come. Proof, not of innocence, but of truth. She set the letter down, her throat tight. Why would you do this for me? Elias looked back to the forge, where the fire licked the blackened walls. Because sometimes silence is a kind of violence, and I've been silent too long. Later that evening, they sat on the steps outside his cottage, mugs of steep bark tea warming their hands. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. The world was wrapped in pale stillness. Clara watched the flakes settle in Elias's hair, the gray at his temples catching the light. My husband's name was William, she said. Elias didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. We were married 3 years. No children until the last. He was quiet too, but he laughed easy, built a fence that always leaned a little crooked, thought it gave the yard character. A faint smile touched her lips, but it didn't last. When he died, I didn't cry for a week, just kept working, feeding the mule, fixing the stove. Then one day, I saw his coat still hanging on the nail, and I fell to the floor. Couldn't breathe for a whole hour. Thought the world would end right there. She looked down into her cup. And then I got the letter from Tobias. And I thought maybe, just maybe. Elias's voice came low, steady. You wanted a place to belong. That's not a crime. No, she said. But it feels like one in a town like this. The next Sunday, Clara didn't attend service. Instead, she stood by the chapel steps afterward, watching as people filed out in tidy lines. Pastor Hale shook hands, offered blessings, and avoided her eyes. Then Tobias stepped forward, holding his hat against his chest like it might soften the sharpness of his voice. Clara, he said, loud enough for others to hear, I've been thinking about what happened. Maybe we both made mistakes. She stood still, unmoving. I didn't know the full story, he continued, but I'm willing to overlook things, for the child's sake. Behind her, Elias emerged from the chapel shadow. She doesn't need overlooking, he said, voice clear and deep. She needs telling the truth. Tobias stiffened. This isn't your concern. Elias stepped forward. The wind lifted the edges of his coat, his presence calm but unyielding. I wrote to her old pastor. Got the records. Marriage license. Death notice. Even the registry for the land they worked. She's not hiding anything. You just didn't care to ask. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She's not a liar, Elias continued. She's a widow, and the child she carries is loved. Was loved before you ever laid eyes on her. Tobias's jaw worked, but he didn't speak. Elias turned to the crowd. You all watched her walk down that aisle alone. You all heard what he said, and none of you stood beside her. But I did. I saw her. I still do. The silence that followed was not the sharp kind that cut. It was the kind that shifts things, even if only a little. Tobias left without another word. Later that day, as Clara swept the chapel steps, a small girl approached her with a ribbon in her hand. My mama says she was wrong, the girl said, offering the ribbon. Clara took it gently, unsure of what to say. She says people forget how to be kind sometimes. Clara crouched and tied the ribbon in the girl's hair. Sometimes, she whispered, they just need reminding. That evening, she and Elias sat in the forge again. The fire was low. The baby kicked beneath her ribs. She pressed her hand there and smiled, just slightly. Do you ever think about starting over? She asked. Elias didn't answer right away. I think about continuing, he said finally. Starting over feels like erasing something. But continuing, that feels more honest. She turned that over in her mind like a coin. I'd like to continue, she said. He looked at her, and something in his gaze settled deeper than comfort. It was recognition, and it held no expectations, only presence. That night, as the wind howled against the eaves, Clara lay in her cot in the chapel loft and didn't feel afraid. She knew the town hadn't changed. Not fully, not yet. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted, and she'd seen enough seasons to know that even the hardest earth can give way to bloom, given time. She slept with one hand on her belly, The other curled around the carved wooden horse Elias had given her. And somewhere in the silence, she knew she was no longer alone. Spring came as quietly as Clara had, arriving not in grand declarations, but in small promises. A loosened frost on the window panes, the slow drip of meltwater from the chapel eaves, the murmur of new buds along the willow's thinning limbs. The town thawed under it too, though slower, more stubborn. Snow still lined the edges of the road where sun didn't reach, but daffodils had begun to push through the soil behind the blacksmith's cottage, nodding their yellow heads like cautious children. Clara moved into the back room of the forge in March. There was no announcement, no handshake agreement, no town gathering to mark the moment. She simply began waking there, sleeping near the heat of the forge's old stones, folding laundry in Elias's wash basin, placing her books along the shelf beneath his window. It wasn't spoken, but it was understood. Between them, things were seldom spoken aloud. They didn't need to be. She still cleaned the chapel in the mornings, often before the sun fully crested the ridgeline. Elias built her a stool with a curved back to ease her aches, and she kept a basket of dry cloths beneath the pulpit. Sometimes, townsfolk left small offerings on the bench outside, jars of jam, a pair of baby socks, a blue shawl woven in fine yarn. Clara accepted them all with the quiet grace of someone who'd once been denied even the simplest kindness. One morning, Elias stood in the doorway of the forge holding a folded paper. His brows were drawn tight, eyes unreadable. "What is it?" Clara asked, pausing from washing the hearth bricks. "From the land office," he said. "Your old home." The titles changed hands. Her breath caught. The place she and William had worked, the place she had buried a future in, now belonged to someone else. "Are you angry?" he asked. "No," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I thought I'd feel grief again, but I don't. That chapter's done. The pages are turned." Elias watched her carefully. Then he placed the letter aside, walked to where she stood, and touched her wrist. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded her, rooted her in this moment, not the ones behind. "I think," she said softly, "that maybe I've been searching for home in things that were never meant to hold me." "And now?" he asked. She looked around, the forge, the garden sprouting in cautious green, the sky just beginning to open blue. "Now I think maybe home is something you grow into, like a pair of boots or a name you weren't sure suited you until someone said it like they meant it." That night, the contractions began. She didn't scream. Clara had never been one to waste breath on things that didn't need saying. Instead, she braced her hands on the kitchen table, her knuckles white, her forehead damp, as Elias gathered blankets and water. He moved with a steadiness born not of training, but of character. When she collapsed to her knees on the floor, he knelt with her. When she bit down on a strip of leather to keep from shouting, he whispered words into her ear, not of comfort, but of presence. "I'm here. I see you. You're not alone." It was just the two of them, the forge dark except for firelight, the storm outside threatening but distant. The child came at dawn, in a silence that felt sacred. A girl, wrapped in Clara's old shawl, eyes squinted shut, fists curled. Clara held her against her chest and wept for the first time in months. They named her Hope. Elias carved the name into a beam above the hearth, small and simple. The town responded with quiet surprise. Mrs. Melgrove sent a pie, with a note tucked beneath the crust. Pastor Hale came to visit, awkward and fumbling, asking if the child might one day want to be baptized. Mr. Finch brought a tiny pair of hand-carved booties, muttering something about tradition. But it wasn't their kindness that made the days easier. It was the rhythm, the feeding, the rocking, the breath of a new life folded into their own. Elias held the baby like she was made of stars and river stones, something old and infinite and delicate all at once. Clara watched him from the rocker, her fingers mending one of his shirts. She never said the word love, but she didn't need to. One afternoon, as she walked into town with Hope wrapped against her chest, she passed Tobias standing outside the general store. He was older now, or maybe just tired. His boots were scuffed, and his shirt too fine for the work he likely didn't do. "Clara," he said, not with arrogance this time, but uncertainty. She stopped, faced him. That your child? She's mine. He looked at the infant, then back at her. There was something unfamiliar in his face. Maybe regret. Maybe just the faintest edge of understanding. I was wrong, he said. About everything. She nodded once. Not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. I know. He stood aside to let her pass. That, too, was a kind of apology. That evening, Clara told Elias what had happened. He said nothing, simply looked into the fire for a long time, then reached for her hand and held it. She squeezed back gently. That was all. As the weeks unfolded, Clara began to write again. Letters to no one. To the girl she had been. To the woman she had become. She kept them in a box by the window, bound in a ribbon Elias had carved from soft bark and dyed with beetroot. She read them aloud sometimes in the hush between dusk and dinner. Elias listened, one hand on Hope's back, the other holding a mug of tea. His presence was like the land, unchanging, patient, enough. In the quiet moments, she thought often of how she had come here with nothing but a dress, a suitcase, and a child who hadn't yet drawn breath. She had been met with cruelty, rejection, cold. But she had endured, not because she was made of iron, but because she was not. Because she bent without breaking, endured without hardening. One Sunday morning, a year to the day after the wedding that never was, Clara stood in the chapel again. This time, not in white, not to be abandoned, not to be stared at or judged. She held Hope in her arms, wrapped in the same blue shawl, and Elias stood beside her, not behind. They didn't speak vows. There were no rings, no ceremony, just a moment where she looked into his eyes and knew this was love. Not the kind that came in thunder or declarations, but the kind that stayed, that showed up, that mended. Afterward, they walked out together. Hope laughed in the breeze. A bird trilled from eaves. And the world, for once, felt wide enough to hold it all. Clara paused before stepping off the chapel porch. She turned back, one last look at the rows of pews where so much pain had once sat beside her. Then she looked forward, at Elias, at the path ahead, at the home they had made not from walls, but from tenderness, from truth. She took a breath and let it fill her. The past was still there, but it no longer held her by the wrist. It had let go.